Daniel Carter never thought a simple yes would rewrite his entire life. Saturday mornings were sacred. Not because life was perfect, but because it was. And this was the only time it felt like it could be. The cafe sat quietly on a corner street, tucked between a bookstore and a flower shop. It wasn't fancy. The chairs creaked, the floor tiles were slightly uneven, and the coffee was just good enough to make you forget everything else. But to Daniel and his 7-year-old daughter, Emma, it was everything. "Dad, you're not listening again." Emma's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "I am listening," Daniel said quickly, blinking. "You were talking about the turtle." Emma narrowed her eyes. "No, I was talking about how my teacher said turtles can live for 100 years. That means one turtle could outlive 5 of you." Daniel laughed softly. "Well, that's comforting." Emma giggled, her small legs swinging under the table. Moments like this were the only pieces of peace Daniel could truly hold on to, and he held them carefully, like something fragile that might disappear if he wasn't paying attention. Life hadn't been kind to him lately, and he knew it. Bills stacked up faster than he could clear them. The repair shop where he worked had cut his hours again, and some nights he lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how long he could keep everything together for Emma. But none of that mattered here, not in this small cafe with the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread. Not while his daughter sat across from him, smiling like the world was still a good place. Emma leaned forward, resting her chin on her hands, her eyes bright with curiosity. She always had questions, endless questions, the kind that made Daniel think deeper than he was used to. "Dad," she asked softly, "do you think things stay forever like the turtle?" Her voice carried a quiet innocence, but there was something else there too, something thoughtful that didn't belong to someone her age. Daniel paused for a moment, his fingers wrapped around his coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into his hands. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a second he didn't see a child. He saw someone growing, someone learning about the world faster than he was ready for. "I think some things do," he replied slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Not everything, but the important things, they find a way to stay." Emma tilted her head slightly, processing his answer, then gave a small nod as if she understood more than she let on. She smiled again, and just like that, the weight on Daniel's shoulders felt a little lighter. The cafe door opened with a soft chime, and a gust of cool air drifted in, carrying with it the faint scent of rain from outside. Daniel didn't think much of it at first. People came and went all the time, but something made him glance up anyway, something he couldn't quite explain. Standing at the entrance was an older man, probably in his late 60s, dressed simply but neatly, his coat slightly worn but clean, his posture straight despite his age. There was nothing extraordinary about him at first glance, yet there was a quiet presence about him that made the room feel just a little different. The man looked around the cafe slowly, as if searching for something, or perhaps deciding where he belonged in that moment. Most of the tables were occupied, and the only empty seat left was the one across from Daniel and Emma. He hesitated for a second, then began walking toward them. Daniel instinctively straightened in his chair, unsure of what was about to happen, while Emma watched the man with open curiosity, completely unbothered. "Excuse me," the man said politely, his voice calm and steady, carrying a warmth that immediately softened the air around him. "Would you mind if I shared this table? It seems I've come at a busy time." Daniel blinked, slightly caught off guard. For a brief moment, his instinct was to say no. This was their space, their little routine, the one place where life felt under control. But then he glanced at Emma, who was already smiling at the man as if she had known him forever, and something in Daniel's hesitation melted away. "Of course," Daniel said, nodding. "Please go ahead." "Thank you," the man replied, taking the seat carefully. "I appreciate it." Emma leaned forward immediately, her curiosity taking over. "Hi," she said cheerfully. "Do you like turtles?" Daniel almost choked on his coffee. The man paused for a second, then smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his eyes. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "I can't say anyone has ever asked me that before, but yes, I suppose I do." Emma grinned proudly, as if she had asked the most important question in the world. Daniel shook his head lightly, a small smile forming despite himself. The tension he had felt just moments ago faded away, replaced by something unexpected, something almost comfortable. The three of them sat there for a while, sharing the quiet hum of the cafe. The clinking of cups, the low murmur of conversations, the occasional laugh from another table. It all blended into a soft background noise that made the moment feel oddly peaceful. The man ordered a simple cup of tea, thanking the waitress with a kindness that didn't go unnoticed. Daniel found himself watching him, trying to understand why this stranger felt so different from everyone else. "Beautiful morning," the man said after a moment, glancing toward the window where the light rain had begun to fall gently. "Even the rain seems calm today." Daniel nodded. "Yeah, it's not too bad." Emma turned to look outside, her eyes lighting up. "I like rain," she said. "It makes everything feel new." The man looked at her with quiet interest. "That's a wonderful way to see it," he replied. "Most people only see inconvenience." Emma shrugged lightly. Maybe they're just not looking properly. Daniel couldn't help but smile at that. But as the conversation continued, something inside him shifted. He couldn't explain it, but there was a feeling growing in his chest, a subtle awareness that this moment, this simple encounter, was not as ordinary as it seemed. It was as if life had quietly placed something important in front of him, something he didn't yet understand. The man sipped his tea slowly, then looked at Daniel with a calm, knowing expression. "You have a good daughter," he said. Daniel nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah, I know." "And you're doing better than you think," the man added gently. Daniel froze for a second. He hadn't said anything about his struggles, not a word, yet somehow it felt like the man could see straight through him, past the surface, into the parts he kept hidden from everyone else. Daniel forced a small smile, brushing it off. "I'm trying," he said simply. The man nodded, as if that answer was enough. But inside Daniel's mind, something stirred. Because for the first time in a long time, it felt like someone had noticed. And he had no idea that this simple moment, this shared table, was about to change everything. Daniel tried to shake off the strange feeling, but it stayed with him, lingering quietly in the background like a thought he couldn't fully catch. He had spent years learning how to carry his struggles silently, how to smile when needed and keep moving forward even when things felt uncertain, so having someone look at him like that, like they understood something he hadn't said, was unfamiliar, almost unsettling. Yet at the same time, there was something comforting about it, something that made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. He picked up his cup again, taking a slow sip of coffee, as if that small action could steady his thoughts and bring him back to the simplicity of the moment. Emma, however, was completely unfazed by any of it, as children often are. She had already moved on to her next curiosity, watching the man with open fascination, as though she had discovered a new character in one of her storybooks. "Do you come here a lot?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, her voice carrying that same natural warmth that seemed to invite conversation without effort. The man chuckled softly, setting his cup down with care, as if even the smallest movements held intention. "Not as often as I probably should," he replied. "But sometimes the right place calls you at the right time." His words sounded simple, yet they carried a quiet depth that made Daniel glance at him again, wondering what exactly he meant by that. There was a brief pause, the kind that doesn't feel empty but rather full of unspoken thoughts. Outside, the rain had grown a little steadier, tapping gently against the window, creating a soft rhythm that wrapped around the cafe like a quiet melody. People continued with their conversations, unaware that at this small table something subtle but meaningful was unfolding. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his instincts still trying to make sense of the man in front of him. "So, what do you do?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, though there was a hint of curiosity he couldn't hide. The man smiled again, but this time there was something different in it, something reflective, almost nostalgic. "I used to do many things," he said slowly. "Now I suppose I mostly observe." Daniel raised an eyebrow, unsure whether to take that as a joke or something more serious. "Observe," he repeated. The man nodded, glancing around the cafe for a moment before returning his gaze to Daniel. "People, moments, choices, life has a way of revealing itself if you pay attention long enough." His voice remained calm, steady, but his words carried a weight that made Daniel feel like there was more beneath the surface, something he wasn't quite grasping yet. Emma leaned closer, clearly intrigued. "So you just watch people all day?" she asked, her tone filled with innocent curiosity rather than suspicion. The man laughed lightly, shaking his head. "Not all day," he replied, "but enough to understand a few things." Emma seemed satisfied with that answer, nodding as if it made perfect sense to her, while Daniel found himself more puzzled than before. He wasn't used to conversations like this, conversations that didn't follow a clear path or lead to predictable answers. It felt almost like trying to read a book where every page hinted at something bigger but never fully explained it. Waitress returned briefly, placing a small plate of biscuits next to the man's tea. He thanked her again with the same gentle politeness, then without hesitation slid the plate slightly toward Emma. "Would you like one?" he asked. Emma looked at Daniel instinctively, waiting for permission. Daniel gave a small nod and she reached out, taking one with a bright smile. "Thank you," she said cheerfully. The man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging her gratitude in a way that felt almost old-fashioned, yet sincere. As Emma happily nibbled on the biscuit, Daniel noticed something else, something small but impossible to ignore. The man's hands, though steady, carried the subtle marks of time, fine lines, faint scars, the kind that spoke of experience rather than weakness. This wasn't just someone who had lived quietly. This was someone who had seen things, endured things, perhaps even lost things. And for some reason, that realization made Daniel feel a quiet respect he hadn't expected. "You ever feel like things don't go the way they're supposed to?" Daniel asked suddenly, surprising even himself. The question slipped out before he could stop it, as if something about the man made it easier to speak honestly. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow sip of his tea, considering the question carefully, giving it the weight it deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer, more thoughtful. "All the time," he said. "But I've learned that supposed to is often just a story we tell ourselves. Life doesn't follow our plans, it follows its own path." Daniel let out a quiet breath, leaning back slightly. "Yeah, feels like that lately," he admitted, his voice carrying a hint of fatigue he couldn't hide. For a moment he regretted saying it, exposing even a small piece of what he usually kept buried. But the man didn't react with pity or judgment. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging something completely natural. "Struggle doesn't mean you're failing," the man said calmly. "Sometimes it means you're exactly where you need to be, even if it doesn't feel like it." Emma looked between them, sensing the shift in tone even if she didn't fully understand it. She reached across the table, placing her small hand over Daniel's. "You're not failing, Dad," she said softly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. Daniel looked at her, his expression softening instantly, the tension in his chest easing just a little. He squeezed her hand gently. "I know," he said, though part of him still wasn't sure. The man watched the exchange with a quiet smile, one that carried both warmth and something deeper, something almost knowing. "She believes in you," he said. "That's more powerful than you realize." Daniel nodded, though he didn't fully respond. He didn't need to. The truth of it was already settling inside him. Outside, the rain began to slow, the clouds shifting slightly as a faint light broke through, casting a soft glow across the cafe. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable, but it changed the atmosphere just enough to feel like something was shifting. Daniel glanced at the window, then back at the man, a thought forming slowly in his mind. "Have we met before?" he asked. The man's smile deepened, but he didn't answer directly. Instead, he said something that made Daniel's heart pause for just a second. "Not yet," he replied quietly. And in that moment, Daniel realized. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was the beginning of something he didn't yet understand, but would never forget. Daniel sat there in silence for a few seconds after the man's words, trying to process what he had just heard. But the sentence lingered in his mind in a way that didn't feel normal, as if it carried a meaning that extended far beyond its simplicity. Not yet. It wasn't the kind of answer people usually gave, and yet the man had said it so calmly, so naturally, that it didn't feel like a joke or an attempt to confuse him. It felt deliberate, as if the words had been chosen carefully, as if they were part of something larger that Daniel wasn't yet able to see. He shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table for a brief moment before he relaxed again, trying to ground himself in reality. The cafe was still the same, the quiet hum of conversation still filled the air, and Emma was still sitting beside him, happily finishing her biscuit as if nothing unusual had happened, but something inside Daniel had changed, something subtle but undeniable. He glanced at the man again, studying him more closely this time, trying to find something, anything, that would explain why this interaction felt so different. The man seemed completely at ease, his posture relaxed, his movements unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. There was no sign of tension, no hint of discomfort, just a quiet presence that seemed to anchor the space around him. Daniel had met all kinds of people in his life, customers at the repair shop, strangers on the street, people passing through without leaving any lasting impression. But this man didn't fit into any category he recognized. There was something about him that made Daniel feel like he was sitting across from someone who knew more than they were saying, someone who had already seen how things would unfold. Emma suddenly spoke again, breaking the silence in the most natural way possible. "Do you have a family?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent curiosity, as if she were asking about something simple and ordinary. Daniel instinctively tensed slightly, unsure if the question might be too personal, but the man didn't seem bothered at all. Instead, he leaned back gently, his eyes softening in a way that suggested both warmth and memory. "I did," he said quietly. "A long time ago." There was no sadness in his voice, but there was something else, something deeper, something that hinted at a story that had already been lived and completed. Emma nodded slowly, accepting the answer without needing further explanation, as children often do, while Daniel felt a faint pull in his chest, a sense that there was more behind those words than the man was willing to share. The rain outside had almost completely stopped now, leaving behind a soft, reflective glow on the streets as the light filtered through the clouds. It cast a gentle brightness into the cafe, illuminating the table just enough to make everything feel slightly more vivid, slightly more real, as if the moment itself had become sharper. Daniel found himself becoming more aware of everything. The sound of Emma's quiet breathing, the faint clink of cups from the counter, the way the man's gaze occasionally drifted toward the window as if he were observing something beyond the glass. It was a strange awareness, one that made time feel slower, heavier, as though each second carried more weight than usual. "You know," the man said suddenly, his voice calm but carrying a quiet intensity that drew Daniel's attention immediately. "Most people go through their lives waiting for something big to happen, something that will change everything." He paused for a moment, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "But the truth is, it's usually the small moments that matter the most, the ones we almost ignore." Daniel listened carefully, something about the way the man spoke making it impossible not to pay attention. It didn't feel like casual conversation anymore. It felt like something important was being said, something that Daniel was meant to hear. Emma leaned slightly closer, her eyes focused on the man as if she were listening to a story. "Like what?" she asked softly. The man smiled gently at her, then glanced at Daniel before answering. "Like choosing to sit with someone instead of walking away," he said. "Like saying yes when it would have been easier to say no." Daniel felt a sudden stillness inside him, a quiet realization forming almost instantly. If he had said no, if he had chosen to keep this table to himself, this moment wouldn't exist. This conversation wouldn't be happening. This feeling, this strange sense that something important was unfolding, would have never even begun. Daniel exhaled slowly, his thoughts shifting in a way he hadn't expected. "So you're saying this matters?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. The man nodded, his expression steady. "More than you realize," he replied. "Some moments are small on the surface, but they carry consequences far beyond what we can see." There was something about the way he said it, something certain, something that didn't sound like speculation or philosophy, but like knowledge. For a brief moment, Daniel felt a strange sensation, as if the space around him had shifted slightly, as if the air itself had grown heavier, more meaningful. He couldn't explain it, and part of him didn't want to. He simply sat there, absorbing the moment, trying to understand why it felt so different from anything he had experienced before. Emma, however, remained perfectly at ease, as if she belonged in this moment more naturally than he did. She smiled softly, then looked at the man with a simple honesty that cut through everything else. "I'm glad you sat with us," she said. The man's expression softened even more, a quiet warmth spreading across his face. "So am I," he replied. Daniel watched them, something stirring deep inside him, something that felt both unfamiliar and strangely familiar at the same time. It was as if a part of him was beginning to wake up, to notice things he had been too distracted or too tired to see before. The weight of his struggles didn't disappear, but they felt different now, less overwhelming, less suffocating, as if they were just one part of a much larger picture. Then, without warning, the man reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object, placing it gently on the table between them. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his curiosity immediately drawn to it. It was an old watch, simple in design but clearly well cared for, its surface worn just enough to show that it had been used for many years. The ticking was faint but steady, a quiet reminder of time passing moment by moment. "This," the man said calmly, "was given to me a long time ago, during a moment I almost ignored." Daniel frowned slightly, his eyes fixed on the watch. "What do you mean?" he asked. The man looked at him, and for the first time there was something unmistakable in his gaze, something that made Daniel's heart skip just slightly. I mean, the man said quietly, that some moments don't just change your life, they connect to others in ways you can't understand yet. Daniel felt a chill run through him, though the cafe was warm. Because suddenly, it didn't feel like this was just a story anymore. It felt like something was being passed on. And he was right in the middle of it. Daniel stared at the watch resting on the table, his eyes fixed on its slow, steady movement, as if each tick carried a meaning he couldn't quite grasp yet. The sound was faint, almost lost beneath the soft noise of the cafe, yet somehow it felt louder than everything else, echoing quietly in his mind. He reached out hesitantly, his fingers hovering just above it for a moment before finally touching the cool surface. There was nothing extraordinary about it at first glance. No shining gold, no intricate design, just a simple, worn piece of time that had clearly lived a long life. But the moment his fingers made contact, something shifted inside him, a subtle but undeniable sensation, like a memory trying to surface from somewhere deep and distant. The man watched him closely, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with a calm patience that suggested he had already seen this moment play out countless times in his mind. It doesn't look like much, the man said quietly, his voice steady, but it carries something most people overlook. Daniel swallowed lightly, his gaze still locked on the watch. And what is that? He asked, though part of him wasn't sure he was ready for the answer. The man leaned forward slightly, his expression soft but serious. A reminder, he said. That time is not just something we pass through, it's something we shape with every choice we make. Emma leaned closer as well, her curiosity drawing her in just as much as Daniel's uncertainty did. She looked at the watch, then up at the man, her eyes wide with interest. Is it magic? She asked softly. The man smiled gently, shaking his head. Not in the way you're thinking, he replied. It won't grant wishes or change the past, but it will show you something far more important if you're willing to see it. Daniel frowned slightly, his mind racing to keep up with everything that was being said. None of it sounded impossible, yet none of it sounded ordinary either. It was as if the man was speaking in a language that made sense only if you stopped trying to force it into logic. Why are you giving this to me? Daniel asked, his voice lower now, more cautious, as if he was beginning to realize that this moment carried more weight than he had initially believed. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked at Emma for a brief moment, then back at Daniel, his gaze steady and clear. Because once a long time ago, he began slowly, someone sat where you're sitting now facing a choice that seemed small at the time, and they chose to say yes. Daniel felt his chest tighten slightly, the connection forming almost instantly in his mind. You mean like me? He asked. The man nodded. And that choice, he continued, led to a chain of moments, decisions, and paths that shaped not only their life, but the lives of others they would never even meet. Daniel felt a strange mix of emotions rise within him, confusion, curiosity, and something else, something deeper that he couldn't fully name. So you're saying this moment matters because of what comes after? He asked, trying to make sense of it. The man smiled faintly. I'm saying every moment matters, he replied. But most people only realize it when it's too late to see where it could have led. The cafe seemed quieter now, as if the world itself had softened to allow this conversation to exist without interruption. Even the light streaming through the window felt warmer, more focused, casting a gentle glow over the table as if highlighting the significance of what was unfolding. Daniel glanced at Emma, who was now watching him with a quiet seriousness that didn't belong to a child her age. And in that moment, something inside him shifted again, something clearer this time, something more certain. What do I do with it? Daniel asked, lifting the watch slightly, feeling its weight in his hand. The man leaned back, his expression calm, almost peaceful. You don't do anything special, he said. You live, you choose, you pay attention, and when the moment comes, you pass it on. Daniel's heart skipped slightly at those words. Pass it on, he repeated. The man nodded, just like I did. There was a brief silence after that, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, as if everything that needed to be said had already been spoken, leaving only understanding behind. Daniel looked at the watch again, then slowly closed his hand around it, a quiet decision forming within him, one that didn't need words to exist. Emma smiled softly, as if she could feel that decision without needing to hear it. When Daniel looked up again, ready to say something, anything, to ask one more question, to understand just a little more. The chair across from him was empty. The man was gone. There was no sound of a door, no sign of movement, no trace of where he had gone or how he had left. It was as if he had simply stepped out of the moment itself, leaving nothing behind but the memory of his presence and the watch resting in Daniel's hand. Daniel blinked, looking around the cafe quickly, half expecting to see him at another table or near the door, but there was nothing. The world had returned to normal, the conversations, the clinking cups, the quiet rhythm of everyday life, all continuing as if nothing unusual had happened at all. "Dad," Emma's voice brought him back. He looked at her, still trying to steady his thoughts. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Daniel took a slow breath, then nodded, a small but genuine smile forming on his face. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think I am." He looked down at the watch one more time, then carefully placed it into his pocket, feeling its presence as something more than just an object. It wasn't about what it could do. It was about what it meant. They finished their morning together, just like they always did, but something was different now. Daniel noticed it in the way he listened more closely to Emma's stories, in the way he looked at the world around him with a little more awareness, a little more intention. Nothing had magically changed, yet everything felt slightly more meaningful. And as they stepped out of the cafe into the fresh air after the rain, Daniel realized something simple, yet powerful. The moment that had changed everything was the one he almost ignored, and somewhere in a future he couldn't yet see. He would sit across from someone else and ask the same quiet question: "Would you mind if I shared this table?"